Gaza in Crisis: Reflections on Israel's War Against the Palestinians by Ilan Pappe and Noam Chomsky, edited by Frank Barat. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Contents. Introduction. Chapter 1. The Fate of Palestine, an interview with Noam Chomsky, 2007. Chapter 2. Clusters of History, U.S. Involvement in the Palestine Question. Introduction. When Noam Chomsky first answered my email in December 2005, I would never have imagined that 5 years later I would be working on a book with him. Since then, Chomsky has continued to reply to my emails and questions, and we have slowly developed a steady, written relationship. A few years after that first email, thinking about how to raise awareness and reach a wider audience on the Palestine question, I asked him if he would agree to an interview. He did, and a few months later sent me his answers, which as usual were more detailed and researched than I could have expected. The interview was well received and published on various websites and in publications, prompting me to consider the format an excellent way to inform and educate a public that too often has to rely on information from a corporate and profit-driven media system. The idea of another interview slowly made its way in my head, but this time I wanted something different, something more interactive. I decided to ask the renowned Israeli historian Ilan Pappe if he would participate in a joint interview/dialogue with Professor Chomsky. Pappe agreed, and during the next few months I worked with both of them on various questions and key topics of what is usually referred to as the Israel-Palestine conflict. When that interview came out, probably because it was the first Chomsky-Pappe interview ever conducted, it appeared in even more publications and websites than the first one and came to the attention of a Belgian publisher, Gilles Martin, who consequently published the interview as a booklet entitled Le Champ du Possible, Aden Editions, November 2008. Then came an offer to create an English version of that booklet. But it needed more work. I started to think about what type of book I wanted, what would be its goal and its substance. The last thing I wanted was to publish a book merely for the sake of it. Hundreds of books on the Israel-Palestine conflict already exist, some exceptional, so how would this one be different? To answer this, I asked myself, why has this conflict lasted for so long, who can stop it, and how? Ignorance, the people, and by popular resistance and a refusal to remain silent were the first answers that came to mind. I sincerely believe that what is happening in Palestine would never have lasted this long if the public were properly informed about what had been really taking place in this part of the Middle East. Noam, Ilan, and I worked on the dialogue, now titled The Ghettoization of Palestine, again, gave it more insight, edited some questions, and added new ones. Ilan additionally contributed several articles addressing various crucial aspects of the Israel-Palestine question, and Noam reworked his astonishing piece, Exterminate All the Brutes, Gaza 2009. Combining interviews and essays was important. On one hand, the interactive joint interview/dialogue form is a means to express and explore researched analysis and opinions in an accessible way. It also offers a more flexible and lively vehicle to share expert knowledge. The joint interview, with two of the most respected people in this field of study, one an American professor and one an Israeli historian, could fill in gaps of understanding and reach a wider audience. Both interviews address multiple topics related to the Israel-Palestine question as well as the recent Israeli army attack on the Freedom Flotilla and, hopefully, allow readers to draw their own conclusions from two compatible yet different views. On the other hand, the solely authored essays give the book a more in-depth analysis, scrutinizing specific periods and events in history in a new light, challenging, even more well-versed, readers in the process. Selected articles by Ilan Pappe give the necessary historical background that is key to understanding Palestine today. In chapters 2 and 3, Ilan Pappe traces the historical development of U.S. involvement in the question of Palestine and the importance of Nakba, catastrophe in Arabic, denial for Israel. Understanding the Nakba is crucial to understanding Palestinian-Israeli history. Chapter 4 is the updated and superb essay, Exterminate All the Brutes, Gaza 2009, by Chomsky. This groundbreaking piece focuses primarily on the December 2008 to January 2009 Israeli assault on Gaza, but also gives a thorough analysis of Israel's relations with the United States and Europe, and the role of social and military resistance in Arab countries. We return to Pappe in chapters 5 and 7 where he charts the progress of the movement for one state, and lastly, the Israeli army's massacres in Gaza. These articles offer an alternative narrative to that which is presented by the Israeli government, and I am sure will help people to reframe the conflict. The book closes with Chomsky's latest reflections on the peace process. My hope is that this book can be used as a guide in excavating the past for the benefit of a more clear-sighted present, and a justice-centered future in which human rights are universal and justice restored. Frank Barat, London, July 2010. Chapter 1. The Fate of Palestine, an interview with Noam Chomsky, 2007. What is your view of the situation in Gaza today? Could it mark the beginning of the end for the Palestinian Authority? Some background is necessary. Let's begin with January 2006, when Palestinians voted in a carefully monitored election, pronounced to be free and fair by international observers, despite U.S. efforts to swing the election toward their favorite, Mahmoud Abbas and his Fatah party. But Palestinians committed a grave crime, by Western standards. They voted the wrong way. The United States instantly joined Israel in punishing Palestinians for their misconduct, with Europe toddling along behind as usual. There is nothing novel about the reaction to these Palestinian misdeeds. Though it is obligatory to hail our leaders for their sincere dedication to bringing democracy to a suffering world, perhaps in an excess of idealism, the more serious scholar/advocates of the mission of democracy promotion recognize that there is a strong line of continuity running through all administrations. The United States supports democracy if and only if it conforms to U.S. strategic and economic interests. In short, the project is pure cynicism, if viewed honestly. And quite commonly, the U.S. project should be described as one of blocking democracy, not promoting it. Dramatically so in the case of Palestine. The punishment of Palestinians for the crime of voting the wrong way was severe. With constant U.S. backing, Israel increased its violence in Gaza, withheld funds that it was legally obligated to transmit to the Palestinian Authority, tightened its siege, and in a gratuitous act of cruelty, even cut off the flow of water to the arid Gaza Strip. The Israeli attacks became far more severe after the capture of Corporal Gilad Shalit on June 25, 2006, which the West portrayed as a terrible crime. Again, pure cynicism. Just one day before, Israel kidnapped 2 civilians in Gaza, a far worse crime than capturing a soldier, and transported them to Israel, in violation of international law, but that is routine, where they presumably joined the roughly 1,000 prisoners held by Israel without charges, hence kidnapped. None of this merits more than a yawn in the West. There is no need here to run through the ugly details, but the U.S.-Israel made sure that Hamas would not have a chance to govern. And of course, The two leaders of the rejectionist camp flatly rejected Hamas's call for a long-term ceasefire, to allow for negotiations in terms of the international consensus on a two-state settlement, which the United States and Israel reject, as they have done in virtual isolation for over 30 years, with rare and temporary departures. Meanwhile, Israel stepped up its programs of annexation, dismemberment, and imprisonment of shrinking Palestinian cantons in the West Bank, always with decisive U.S. backing despite occasional minor complaints, accompanied by the wink of an eye and munificent funding. The programs were formalized in Prime Minister Ehud Olmert's Convergence program, which spells the end of any viable Palestinian state. His program was greeted in the West with much acclaim as moderate, because it did not satisfy the demands of Greater Israel extremists. It was soon abandoned as too moderate, again with understanding if mild notes of disapproval by Western hypocrites. There is a standard operating procedure for overthrowing an unwanted government: arm the military to prepare for a military coup. The U.S.-Israel adopted this conventional plan, arming and training Fatah to win by force what it lost at the ballot box. The United States also encouraged Mahmoud Abbas to amass power in his own hands, steps that are quite appropriate in the eyes of Bush administration advocates of presidential dictatorship. As for the rest of the quartet, Russia has no principled objection to such steps, the UN is powerless to defy the master, and Europe is too timid to do so. Egypt and Jordan supported the effort, consistent with their own programs of internal repression and barring of democracy, with U.S. backing. The strategy backfired. Despite the flow of military aid, Fatah forces in Gaza were defeated in a vicious and brutal conflict, which many close observers describe as a preemptive strike targeting primarily the security forces of the brutal Fatah strongman Mohammed Dahlan. However, those with overwhelming power can often snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, and the U.S.-Israel quickly moved to turn the outcome to their benefit. They now have a pretext for tightening the stranglehold on the people of Gaza, cheerfully pursuing policies that the prominent international law scholar Richard Falk describes as a prelude to genocide that should remind the world of the famous post-Nazi pledge of never again. 4. The U.S.-Israel can pursue the project with international backing unless Hamas meets the three conditions imposed by the international community, a technical term referring to the U.S. government and whoever goes along with it. For Palestinians to be permitted to peek out of the walls of their Gaza dungeon, Hamas must, 1. Recognize Israel, or in a more extreme form, Israel's right to exist, that is, the legitimacy of Palestinians' expulsion from their homes. 2. Renounce violence. 3. Accept past agreements, in particular, the roadmap of the quartet. The hypocrisy again is stunning. No such conditions are imposed on those who wear the jackboots. 1. Israel does not recognize Palestine, in fact, is devoting extensive efforts to ensure that there will be no viable Palestine ever, always with decisive U.S. support. 2. Israel does not renounce violence, and it is ridiculous even to raise the question with regard to the United States. 3. Israel firmly rejects past agreements, in particular, the roadmap, with U.S. support. The first 2 points are obvious. The third is correct, but scarcely known. While Israel formally accepted the roadmap, it attached 14 reserva tie-ins that completely eviscerate it. To take just the first, Israel demanded that for the process to commence and continue, the Palestinians must ensure full quiet, education for peace, cessation of incitement, dismantling of Hamas and other organizations, and other conditions. And even if they were to satisfy this virtually impossible demand, the Israeli cabinet proclaimed that The roadmap will not state that Israel must cease violence and incitement against the Palestinians. 5. The other reservations continue in the same vein. Israel's instant rejection of the roadmap, with U.S. support, is unacceptable to the Western self-image, so it has been suppressed. The facts did finally break into the mainstream with the publication of Jimmy Carter's Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. The book elicited a torrent of abuse and desperate efforts to discredit it, but these sections, the only part of the book that would have been new to readers with some familiarity with the topic, were scrupulously avoided. It would, rightly, be considered utterly ludicrous to demand that a political party in the United States or Israel meet such conditions, though it would be fair to ask that the two states with overwhelming power meet them. But the imperial mentality is so deeply embedded in Western culture that this travesty passes without criticism, even notice. While now in a position to crush Gaza with even greater cruelty, Israel can also proceed, with U.S. backing, to implement its plans in the West Bank, expecting to have the tacit cooperation of Fatah leaders who will be amply rewarded for their capitulation. Among other steps, Israel began to release the funds, estimated at $600 million, that it had stolen in reaction to the January 2006 election, and is making a few other gestures. The programs of undermining democracy are proceeding with shameless self-righteousness and ill-concealed pleasure, with gestures to keep the natives contented, at least those who play along, while Israel continues its merciless repression and violence, and, of course, its immense projects to ensure that it will take over whatever is of value to it in the West Bank. All thanks to the benevolence of the gracious rich uncle. To turn finally to your question, the end of the Palestinian Authority might not be a bad idea for Palestinians, in the light of U.S.-Israeli programs of rendering it nothing more than a quisling regime to oversee their extreme rejectionist designs. What should concern us much more is that U.S.-Israeli triumphalism, and European cowardice, might be the prelude to the death of a nation, a rare and somber event. Do you think that there are any conditions under which the United States might change its policy of unconditional support to Israel? A large majority of Americans oppose U.S. government policy and support the international consensus on a two-state settlement. In recent polls, it's called the Saudi Plan, referring to the position of the Arab League, supported by virtually the entire world apart from the United States and Israel. Furthermore, a large majority think that the United States should deny aid to either of the contending parties, Israel and the Palestinians, if they do not negotiate in good faith toward this settlement. This is one of a great many illustrations of a huge gap between public opinion and public policy on critical issues. It should be added that few people are likely to be aware that their preferences would lead to cutting off all aid to Israel. To understand this consequence, one would have to escape the grip of the powerful and largely uniform doctrinal system, which labors to project an image of U.S. benevolence, Israeli righteousness, and Palestinian terror and obstructionism, whatever the facts. To answer your question, U.S. policy might well change if the United States became a functioning democratic society, in which an informed public has a meaningful voice in policy formation. That's the task for activists and organizers, not just in this case. One can think of other possible conditions that might lead to a change in U.S. policy, but none that holds anywhere near as much promise as this one. Al Jazeera reported that Tony Blair could soon be appointed the Middle East Quartet's envoy. What message do you think this will send to the Palestinians and others around the region? Perhaps the most apt comment was by the fine Lebanese political analyst Rami Kauri. He said that, appointing Tony Blair as special envoy for Arab-Israeli peace is something like appointing the Emperor Nero. to be the chief fireman of Rome. Blair was indeed appointed as an envoy, but not as the quartet's envoy, except in name. The Bush administration made it very clear at once that he is Washington's envoy, with a very limited mandate. It announced in no uncertain terms that Secretary of State Rice, and the President, would retain unilateral control over the important issues, while Blair would be permitted to deal only with problems of institution building, an impossible task as long as Washington maintains its extreme rejectionist policies. Europe had no noticeable reaction to yet another slap in the face. Washington evidently assumes that Blair will continue to be the spear carrier for the Pax Americana, as his role was described in the Journal of Britain's Royal Institute of International Affairs. Point 2. Do you think that the corporate media in the United States should worry about its lies and fantasies being exposed in online independent media, ZNet, Counterpunch, etc.? Or is there a finite limit on how far these alternative media can ever penetrate the consciousness of a population like that, in the United States? For the present, the media, and the intellectual community, need not be too concerned about the exposure of lies and fantasies. The limit is determined by the strength and commitment of popular movements. They certainly face barriers, but there is no reason to think they are insurmountable ones. Due to constant pressure and lobbying by Professor Alan Dershowitz, Professor Norman Finkelstein was recently denied tenure at DePaul. Why does someone like Dershowitz have so much influence that he can make an institution break its own rules? Dershowitz has been repeatedly exposed as a dedicated liar, charlatan, and opponent of elementary civil rights, and he is, uncontroversially, an extreme apologist for the crimes and violence of the State of Israel. But he is taken seriously by the media and the academic world. That tells us quite a lot about the reigning intellectual culture. As to why institutions succumb, few are willing to endure the deluge of slanders, lies, and defamation poured out by Dershowitz, the Anti-Defamation League, and other apologists for the crimes of their favored state, who are granted free rein with little concern about response. Merely to illustrate, Dershowitz's books are treated with reverence by the Boston Globe, probably the most liberal paper in the country, but they refuse even to review Norman Finkelstein's carefully documented demonstration that they are an absurd collection of fabrication and deceit. Authentic scholarship knows better, as the record clearly shows. But it receives little attention. For the late Edward W. said, the solution was one state where all the citizens, Arabs, Jews, Christians, etc., would have the same democratic rights. Do you think that because of the situation in Gaza and the ever-spreading settlements, the pendulum will now swing toward a one-state solution as being the only possible endpoint to the conflict? 2 points of clarification are necessary. First, there is a crucial difference between a one-state solution and a binational state. In general, nation-states have been imposed with substantial violence and repression for one reason, because they seek to force varied and complex populations into a single mold. One of the more healthy developments in Europe today is the revival of some degree of regional autonomy and cultural identity, reflecting somewhat more closely the nature of the populations. In the case of Israel-Palestine, a one-state solution will arise only on the U.S. model, with extermination or expulsion of the indigenous population. A sensible approach would be advocacy of a binational solution, recognizing that the territory now includes two fairly distinct societies. The second point is that Edward Said, an old and close friend, was one of the earliest and most outspoken supporters of a two-state solution. By the 1990s, he felt that the opportunity had been lost, and he proposed, without much specification, A unitary state, by which I am sure he would have meant a binational state. I purposely use the word propose, not advocate. The distinction is crucial. We can propose that everyone should live in peace and harmony. The proposal rises to the level of advocacy when we sketch a path from here to there. In the case of a unitary, binational, solution, the only advocacy I know of passes through a number of stages. First, a two-state settlement in terms of the international consensus that the United States and Israel have prevented, followed by moves toward binational federation, and finally closer integration, perhaps to a binational democratic state, as circumstances allow. It is of some interest that when binationalist federation, opening the way to closer integration, was feasible, from 1967 to the mid-1970s, suggestions to this effect, my own writings, for example, elicited near hysteria. Today, when they are completely unfeasible, they are treated with respect in the mainstream, New York Times, New York Review of Books, etc. The reason, I suspect, is that a call today for a one-state settlement is a gift to the jingoist right, who can then wail that they are trying to destroy us, so we must destroy them in self-defense. But true advocacy of a binational state seems to me just as appropriate as it has always been. That has been my unchanged opinion since the 1940s. Advocacy, that is, not mere proposal. Looking ahead, what do you consider to be the best case, worst case, and most likely scenarios for the boundaries and control of occupied Palestine in the next 10 years? The worst case would be the destruction of Palestine. The best case in the short term would be a two-state settlement in terms of the international consensus. That is by no means impossible. It is supported by virtually the entire world, including the majority of the U.S. population. It has come rather close, once, during the last month of Clinton's presidency, the sole U.S. departure from extreme rejectionism in the past 30 years. The United States lent its support to the negotiations in Taba, Egypt, in January 2001, which came very close to a settlement in the general terms of the international consensus, before they were called off prematurely by Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. In their final press conference, the negotiators expressed some hope that if they had been permitted to continue their joint work, a settlement could have been reached. The years since have seen many horrors, but the possibility remains. As for the most likely scenario, it looks unpleasantly close to the worst case, but human affairs are not predictable. Too much depends on will and choice. Would you agree with Edward Said when he said, "The most demoralizing aspect of the Zionist-Palestinian conflict is the almost total opposition between the mainstream Israeli and Palestinian points of view. Might it not make sense for a group of universally respected historians and intellectuals, composed equally of Palestinians and Israelis, to hold a series of meetings to try to agree to a modicum of truth about where this conflict actually lies, for them to agree on a body of facts, who took what from whom, who did what to whom, something like a historical truth and political justice committee? Who are the respected historians and intellectuals?" Edward had much more faith in the importance and the integrity of respected intellectuals than I do. That aside, I do not think there is very much dispute about the bare facts, except for fringe liars. Disputes have to do with selection and interpretation. The University and College Union in Britain voted in favor of considering an academic boycott of Israeli universities. Do you think that this and other types of boycotts of Israeli products, for example, are appropriate measures and could have a positive effect on Israeli policies? I have always been skeptical about academic boycotts. There may be overriding reasons, but in general I think that those channels should be kept open. As for boycotts in general, they are a tactic, not a principle. Like other tactics, we have to evaluate them in terms of their likely consequences. That is a matter of prime importance, at least for those who care about the fate of the victims. And circumstances have to be considered with care. Let's consider South Africa and Israel, which are often compared in this context. In the case of South Africa, boycotts had some impact, but it is worth remembering that they were implemented after a long period of education and organizing, which had led to widespread condemnation of apartheid, even within mainstream opinion and powerful institutions. That included the U.S. corporate sector, which has an overwhelming influence on policy formation, transparently. At that stage, boycott became an effective instrument. The case of Israel is radically different. The preparatory educational and organizing work has scarcely been done. The result is that calls for boycott can easily turn out to be weapons for the hard right, and in fact that has regularly, and predictably, happened. Those who care about the fate of Palestinians will not undertake actions that harm them. Nevertheless, carefully targeted boycotts, which are comprehensible to the public in the current state of understanding, can be effective instruments. One example is calls for university divestment from corporations that are involved in U.S. Israeli repression and violence, and denial of elementary human rights. In Europe, a sensible move would be to call for an end to preferential treatment for Israeli exports until Israel stops its systematic destruction of Palestinian agriculture and its barring of economic development. In the United States, it would make good sense to call for reducing U.S. aid to Israel by the estimated $600 million that Israel has stolen by refusing to transmit funds to the elected government, and the cynicism of funneling aid to the faction it supports should be exposed as just another exercise in undermining democracy. Looking farther ahead, a sensible project would be to support the stand of the majority of Americans that all aid to Israel should be canceled, until it agrees to negotiate seriously for a peaceful diplomatic settlement, instead of continuing to act vigorously to undermine the possibility of realizing the international consensus on a two-state settlement. That, however, will require serious educational and organizational efforts. Readers of the mainstream press were well aware of the shocking nature of apartheid. But they are presented daily with the picture of Israel desperately seeking peace but under constant attack by Palestinian terrorists who want to destroy it. That is not just the media, incidentally. Just to illustrate, Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government published a research paper on the 2006 Lebanon War that has to be read to be believed, but is not atypical. It's by Marvin Kalb, a highly respected figure in journalism, head of the Kennedy School's media program. According to his account, the media were almost totally controlled by Hezbollah, and failed to recognize that Israel was engaged in an existential struggle for survival, fighting a two-front war of self-defense against attacks in Lebanon and Gaza. 9 The attack on the pathetic victim from the south was the capture of Corporal Shalit. The kidnapping of Gazan civilians the day before, and innumerable other crimes like it, are more self-defense. The attack from the north was the Hezbollah capture of 2 soldiers on July 12. More cynicism. For decades Israel has been kidnapping and killing civilians in Lebanon, or on the high seas between Lebanon and Cyprus, holding many for long periods as hostages while unknown numbers of others were sent to secret prison torture chambers, like Facility 1391, not reported in the United States. No one has ever condemned Israel for aggression or called for massive terror attacks in retaliation. As always, the cynicism reeks to the skies, illustrating imperial mentality so deeply rooted as to be imperceptible. Continuing with the Kennedy School version of the war, it demonstrates the extreme bias of the Arab press with the horrified revelation that it portrayed Lebanese to Israeli casualties in the ratio of 22-1, whereas objective Western journalism would of course be neutral. The actual ratio was about 25-1. Kalb quotes New York Times correspondent Stephen Erlanger, who was greatly disturbed that photos of destruction in South Beirut lacked context. They did not show that the rest of Beirut was not destroyed. By the same logic, photos of the World Trade Center on September 11 revealed the extreme bias of Western journalism, by failing to show that the rest of New York was untouched. The falsification and deceit, of which these examples are a small sample, would be startling if they were not so familiar. Until that is overcome, punitive actions that are well merited are likely to backfire. All this raises another point. For the most part, Israel can act only within the framework established by the great power on which it has chosen to rely ever since it made the fateful decision in 1971 to prefer expansion to peace, rejecting Egyptian President Anwar Sadat's proposal for a full Israel-Egyptian peace treaty in favor of settlement in the Egyptian Sinai. We can debate the extent to which Israel relies on U.S. support, but there can be little doubt that its crushing of Palestinians and other violent crimes are possible only because the United States provides it with unprecedented economic, military, diplomatic, and ideological support. So if there are to be boycotts, why not of the United States, whose support of Israel is the least of its crimes? Or of the UK, or other criminal states? We know the answer, and it is not an attractive one, undermining the integrity of the call for boycott. Finally, in April 2003, Gilbert Achcar wrote a letter to a slightly depressed anti-war activist, which ended with, "This movement's spectacular growth has only been possible because it rested on the foundations of 3 years of progress by the global movement against neoliberal globalization born in Seattle." These two dimensions will continue to fuel each other, to strengthen people's awareness that neoliberalism and war are two faces of the same system of domination, which must be overthrown. What would be your message today to anti-war and human rights activists around the world about their role in this worldwide struggle? Gilbert Achcar is quite right, though we should recognize, as he surely does, that the North is a latecomer to the very promising global justice movements. They originated in the South, which is why the meetings of the World Social Forum have been held in Brazil, India, Venezuela, Kenya. Also of great significance are the solidarity movements that developed, primarily in the United States, in the 1980s, something quite new in the hundreds of years of Western imperialism, and have since proliferated in many ways. The lesson to activists is stark and simple: the future lies in their hands, including the question of the fate of Palestine. Chapter 2. Clusters of History, U.S. Involvement in the Palestine Question. A thought-provoking article was published by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. Based on extended research, it discussed the power of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, the Israeli lobby in Washington, in shaping American policy in the Middle East in general and toward Israel in particular. Their basic argument was that the lobby directs American policy in a way that undermines the United States' national interest. Not since the 1960s would one have come across such a harsh criticism of either Zionism or U.S. policy from within the heart of American academia or the media. The role of the lobby in shaping U.S. policy in the Middle East is undoubtedly crucial. But American policy in the Middle East, like any regional policy of a great power in the past, is the outcome of more than one factor. For those, like myself, for whom the analysis of such a policy is not just academic but a matter of life and death, an expanded analysis is called for, not only for the sake of understanding that policy more clearly, but also as a way of coping with its dangerous outcomes. As a historian by profession, I hope that seeing the development of this policy in a wider historical spectrum may help those of us who live in the area and in Palestine to better comprehend what one may or may not do vis-a-vis such a powerful factor in our daily lives, one that is likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. A scholarly narrative of chaotic historical processes, such as the development of a particular foreign policy, requires an organizational method that might raise suspicions about a considerable gap between the structured representation of the policy and its actual implementation on the ground. This gap stems from the modern historiographical impulse to, in the words of Hayden White, organize reality with the same clarity as a novelist seeking to construct a lucid world in which a plot has a clear beginning and an end. Historiography is a constructive effort that is meant to expose the past as it really was, if we believe in such a possibility, or, for the sake of making a contemporary point, if we doubt that possibility. But anyone who dares to dive into the ocean of words to be found in the political and diplomatic documents in the various national archives understands how precarious is the story extracted from these heaps of documents, left behind by the chattering classes that shaped our lives over the last 2 centuries. Technically, mapping a clear narrative out of the paperwork requires reliance on only a very small number of documents, chosen according to the subjective preference of the historian and not according to any objective criterion. A middle ground between relativist and positivist views of foreign policy historiography consists of providing readers interested in a particular chapter of such policy with clusters of facts and evidence from the past, each providing a certain insight into the phenomenon being researched. In this article, which follows the history of the American involvement in the Middle East in general and in Palestine in particular, the clusters, when fused together, can supply an expanded explanation for this policy. Any attempt to focus on one cluster alone is problematic, as Mearsheimer and Walt learned from criticism directed at them by friends and foes alike. In what follows, there is an attempt to expand the historical panorama and present 5 clusters of facts and contexts. These are actually 5 legacies that feed into American policy in the Middle East today. At first, these processes developed discreetly but, at a certain historical juncture, they met and fused into one powerful impulse that formulated American policy in this area. The Blackstone-Schofield legacy. If you ignore a no-entry sign on your right when you ascend toward the Jaffa Gate in the Old City of Jerusalem and take the forbidden turn, alongside the old Ottoman wall, driving through the citadel, you will reach one of Jerusalem's hidden gems. On the mountain's slope looking west lies the old Gaza school. Samuel Gaza was an Anglican bishop who built a boys' school there in the mid-19th century that became the main preparatory school for the Palestinian elite. Today it is an American college and, among the beautiful buildings left behind by the Anglicans, the modern-day Americans have planted posters supporting the Great Israel idea and a Zionist Jerusalem, which would not have shamed the most ultra-right Zionist settler movement in Israel. Gaza came to Palestine, as the Americans do today, because he believed that the return of the Jews would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, and the unfolding apocalypse of the end times. But, unlike his contemporary successors, He fell in love with the local population and helped tie them into the global educational system. In a way, he forsook his missionary task for the sake of granting them a more universal education. His efforts helped the embryonic Palestinian national movement to emerge. Pappe was, in many ways, a student of the Irishman John Nelson Darby and the Scot Edward Irving, the fathers of premillenarianist dogma at the beginning of the 19th century. Theirs was a doomsday vision that included the return of the Jews to their biblical homeland, followed by their conversion to Christianity on the way to a full realization of the apocalyptic prophecies. The source, as of so many of these Judeo-Christian dogmas, was Jewish, and its origins can be found in the apocalyptic Jewish thought that evolved around the coming of the Messiah. These Irish and Scottish visions emerged, in an even more zealous form, in the United States. They seem to have rooted themselves in Newton, Massachusetts, once a city of its own, today part of Greater Boston. Newton is a circular suburb, and at its center, in a typical New England wood, lies the Theological Seminary of Andover. In its early days, it hosted a Presbyterian brotherhood that wished to bring the Word of God to the heathen. 250 enthusiastic boys were enlisted for the purpose. A decade later, they were in Palestine and the surrounding area, trying to convert a society that had already encountered the Jesuits and the Greek Orthodox missionaries who had arrived years before. The Andoverians built institutes that, in time, would become the American universities of Cairo and Beirut, the alma maters of the Arab national movement's first generation of leaders. The gospel they brought was, thus, not only that of Jesus but also that of the youngest state in the world, just liberated from the British colonialist yoke. The historian George Antonius, author of the famous Arab Awakening and a senior clerk in the British Mandate government in Palestine, asserted that these missionaries were the principal agents of modernization and nationalization in the formative period of the modern Middle East. With the advent of a more complex theoretical view of how nations are born, the role of the Presbyterian missionaries was diminished, but they are still regarded as a meaningful factor in this story. This ambivalence in the American theological view between a millenarianist vision and identification with the awakening Arab peoples continued until the First World War. We find, at the end of the 19th century, a debate between the two positions. On one side stood the preacher William Blackstone who, in the famous Protestant Convention of 1891, demanded of President Benjamin Harrison that the United States should consider the condition of the Israelites and their claims to Palestine as their ancient home. On the other side stood the American consul in Jerusalem, Selah Merrill, who attempted to counterbalance the growing influence of the "return of the Jews" notion. Merrill wrote to the president that, in his view, which was shared by his friends, the Muslim notables of Jerusalem, Zionism was neither a holy nor a religious phenomenon but, rather, a colonialist project that, he predicted, would not last because it pertained to the Jewish Eastern European world. While the definition is apt, the prediction seems, in hindsight, to be wrong. Millenarianists seemed to gain the upper hand as the years went by. Within the American evangelical scene, the voices of the Merrills weakened and were almost silenced by the vociferous sermons of the Blackstones, whose numbers increased enormously in the 20th century. Their positive view of Zionism was reinforced by the growing tension between the missionaries and the Islamic religious establishments in the Eastern Mediterranean. The missionaries, who once preached for liberation from European colonialism, hoped that American Christianity and not the Islamic tradition would become the leading light of the new nations, as indeed would become the case. In many ways, The second and third generations of missionaries became the first Orientalists, in the full negative meaning of the term. But even before Edward Said attracted our attention to this group, another Edward was warning, 40 years before Said's Orientalism appeared, of the dubious impact of the Orientalist missionary. This was Edward Earle, who, like Said, also taught at Columbia University and who wrote in Foreign Affairs in 1929 that for almost a century American public opinion concerning the Near East was formed by missionaries. If American opinion has been uninformed, misinformed and prejudiced, the missionaries are largely to blame. Interpreting history in terms of the advance of Christianity, they have given an inadequate, distorted, and occasionally a grotesque picture of Muslims and Islam. Point 2. The missionaries presented an even more distorted picture when they focused on Palestine. Their biased and negative descriptions faithfully echoed their immense disappointment at their first physical encounters with the Holy Land. Like Mark Twain, they found it difficult to digest the gap between what they discovered and the vision that the Holy Scriptures had led them to imagine. Like the Zionists who would follow them, as well as the British and Germans who came with them, they did not perceive the locals as a people or a group with rights or claims to the country, but rather as, at best, an exotic specter and, at worst, an ecological nuisance. The Zionist movement, having developed a similar view, immediately won their support, although it would take years before this link became a solid alliance between Christian fundamentalism and the State of Israel, an alliance that would greatly affect American policy in the Middle East as a whole. That alliance was forged when Israel was established in 1948. In the eyes of the Messianic Christians in America, the creation of the State of Israel was the final and decisive proof that the divine apocalyptic schemes were about to materialize. In front of their eyes, the return of the Jews, their conversion to Christianity, and the second coming of the Messiah. Cyrus Scofield, a preacher from Dallas, Texas, was another link in the chain that connected missionary theology on both sides of the Atlantic. This violent priest produced an annotated, fundamentalist version of the Bible that was published by Oxford University Press in 1909. It was, in a way, the most explicit sketch of the three prongs that form the basis for U.S. policy today: the return of the Jews, the decline of Islam, and the rising fortunes of the United States as a world power. Parts of Scofield's sermons sound like contemporary speeches by George W. Bush. The Zionist movement could not have asked for more. The enthusiasm that now gripped Protestants in Britain and the United States was what it most needed to push forward an idea that had, before the Second World War, failed to enthuse most Jews. Texas was indeed an important hub for this activity. It became a spouting fountain of fundamentalist hallucinations that, today, have turned into the policies of another Texan, George W. Bush. As the 20th century marched on, the Southern preachers pushed aside their Eastern colleagues and wrote and prophesied, like the famous Hal Lindsey, that, after Armageddon, millions of Jews would kneel before the returning Christ. This sermon reappears in the ceremonies conducted by Christian Zionists, who flock every year to the ancient ruins of Tel Megiddo, where the final battle between good and evil is supposed to be played out. The delegations are received in Israel as the state's new saviors. Lindsey's book, The Late, Great Planet Earth, is today a hit, an apocalyptic bestseller and the Bible of the average Christian Zionist. Point 2 in it. Unconditional support for an aggressive and destructive Israel is a divine law. What Israel wants is what God wants, is the statement that guided, at its onset, the fundamentalist pilgrimage to Jerusalem in the mid-1980s. And thus, in September 2001, a century after Scofield's Bible appeared, His phantasm became a real policy when the U.S. administration faced a small group of terrorists who came from Saudi Arabia and Egypt and were trained in Afghanistan. The American leadership did not send forces to seek or arrest the terrorists but, instead, waged a total war against Islam, using destructive military force. Substantial aid to, and fortification of, Israel was conceived as the most significant part of the War on Terror. The ideological infrastructure of this Bush policy is very much the legacy of Schofield and his fundamentalist friends. It is possible that the hidden but staunch anti-Semitic element within millenarian dogma deterred the pro-Israeli lobby, at first from associating too strongly with the expanding network of Christian fundamentalist organizations. But in the 1970s all this changed. The Israeli government could not resist the temptation. Menachem Begin led the way, with the help of an enthusiastic young Likudnik, Benjamin Netanyahu. In 1978, the Likud government declared its intention of strengthening the connection with the Christian fundamentalists. It allowed them to open a TV station in southern Lebanon when it was occupied by Israel in Operation Litani. More important was the consent of the government for the opening, in 1980, of the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem. The stronghold of fundamentalism in Israel today, it was built in what must have been the best seat in town, an excellent location overlooking the valley in which the prophesied resurrection would take place. In 1985, Netanyahu, then Israel's ambassador to the UN, declared to the annual convention of Christian Zionists that the latter's support for Israel was a superior moral deed. That night he became the blue-eyed boy for all those who wished to burn the Jews in hell unless they converted to Christianity on Judgment Day. The churches were not content with words alone and established a special outfit that focused on helping Israel inside the United States, which Netanyahu made effective use of when he became prime minister. While the pro-Israeli lobby, see below, concentrated its efforts on wooing the Democratic Party toward Israel, these Christians turned the Republican Party into a sympathizer, at the very least. And one should not underrate this achievement, for the businessmen linked to the Republican Party were more inclined to accept the Arabists' point of view, on which more later, and support a pro-American axis in the Middle East, built on friendly Arab regimes. But this position was neutralized toward the end of the 20th century due to the immense power accumulated by the fundamentalists who, by then, were officially dubbed Christian Zionists. It is noteworthy that the pro-Israeli lobby was established, according to the declared aims of its founder, to eliminate pro-Arab influence in the State Department. This particular mission was accomplished, it seems, not so much by the lobby's effort as by the successful endeavors of the Christian Zionists. History, quite often, is an explosive fusion of discrete processes that produce events later considered to be formative and significant. The Reaganite foreign policy of the 1980s and the historical narrative that accompanied it, which claimed that this American president and his UK colleague Margaret Thatcher were leading a hawkish West into decisive victory over the Great Satan in Moscow, reinforced Christian Zionism even more. It was also fed by a TV revolution that bowdlerized the American value system and collapsed fundamentalist Christianity into the dimensions of the small screen. Flamboyant men appeared as preachers and succeeded, in the typical discourse of this shallow medium, in conveying even more simplified messages from the Christian Zionist pulpit. Thus, the transformations in a bipolar world, the communications revolution, and the rise of the right to power in Israel turned the Jewish state's influence in the United States into a formidable, if not undefeatable, fact of life. Jerry Falwell's shows on TV epitomize this latest transformation in the fundamentalist experience. In 1981, he said on one of his shows, "He who stands against Israel stands against God." In the same year, he received the Jabotinsky Prize from Menachem Begin. The various groups that fell within the category of Christian Zionism won an unprecedented place in the Israeli political system. So, despite vigorous opposition from the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem to any missionary work in the city, Falwell and his friends shifted the focus of Christian Zionist activity to Jerusalem. Ever since, every few years the city has hosted the main convention of American Christian Zionists, a body that has adopted a host of resolutions calling upon Israel to pursue an expansionist policy in the occupied territories, and encouraging the United States to wage continuous war against Islam and the Arab world. These positions were taken long before the United States was attacked by Al-Qaeda. The outcome is that, today, tens of millions, probably around 40 million, of Americans support Israel unreservedly, even expecting it to pursue a maximalist policy against the Arab world and the Palestinians. This body of people brings with it the money that helped install George W. Bush in the White House. Its members are represented in all the important committees on Capitol Hill and in the American media. Ever since the outbreak of the Second Intifada, most of the churches of this persuasion consider volunteering in Israel as mandatory. As if this were not enough, since September 2001, this theology has also adopted a clear anti-Islamic line. In his important work on the subject, Stephen Sizer has revealed how Christian Zionists have constructed a historical narrative that describes the Muslim attitude to Christianity throughout the ages as a kind of a genocidal campaign, first against the Jews and then against the Christians. Hence, what were once hailed as moments of human triumph in the Middle East, the Islamic Renaissance of the Middle Ages, the Golden Era of the Ottomans, the emergence of Arab independence and the end of European colonialism, were recast as the satanic, anti-Christian acts of heathens. In the new historical view, the United States became St. George, Israel his shield and spear, and Islam their dragon. The King Crane Legacy. In the heart of Ohio lies the town of Oberlin. At the beginning of the 19th century it was still a typical Midwest American village, surrounded by infinite cornfields, away from the ivy towers of the east and west coasts. A pastoral part of the world, it would have escaped a place in the collective American memory had it not been for a unique theological college that was established there in 1833. Oberlin College was opened by a clergy very different from those already discussed. Its members were motivated by a commitment to peace and equality, both in the United States and in the world at large. In its early years, the college fought against racial segregation and discrimination against women in American academia. There, in the Gothic-like building of the college, Henry King taught for many years but, as was common for researchers then, he did not specialize in one particular area. At first King was attracted to theological education, then mathematics, and finally philosophy. In 1902 he became the college's president. Then, during the First World War, he left this comfortable position to become the head of the YMCA in Paris. In the photo gallery of the college, one can see a tall man with a Groucho-like mustache decorating his long face, sitting next to a table made fit, lean, and long, to the man's proportions. This was taken at the Paris YMCA. It was while there that King was asked by his good friend, President Woodrow Wilson, to become involved in world politics. The American president wished to exploit the results of the war by disintegrating the big colonial empires, in the name of the right to independence and self-determination. In the Wilsonian vision, the Arab peoples, too, were entitled to the national liberation denied them during 400 years of Ottoman rule. Wilson suspected that Britain and France wanted to replace Turkish imperialism with European colonialism. He therefore asked the peace conference in Versailles to send a commission of inquiry to the Arab world to ascertain the people's aspirations there. The survey included Palestine, and King was his favored candidate to head the mission. King's partner for the mission came from a very different place. In the northeastern part of Istanbul, the University of Boğaziçi overlooks the Straits of the Bosphorus. Its buildings, clinging to the hill slopes that descend to the straits bank, resemble those of Oberlin College, which is no surprise as they were built by American clergymen too. This campus was opened in 1839 and was first named Roberts College. It survived the Great War, which positioned the United States and Turkey as enemies, remaining an American cultural center at the heart of Istanbul. Charles Crane, a businessman from Chicago and a diplomat of sorts, was the campus's main trustee. He was about to invest more time in it as part of his plan to expand an all-American campus system in the Arab world, when he, too, was called on by President Wilson to assist King in his Middle East peace mission. 5 Crane gladly agreed to take part in what was an effort to enhance the independence of the Arab peoples according to the principle of self-determination, as articulated by the President in his famous 1914 speech at Mount Vermont. When King and Crane arrived at the offices of the peace conference, they found that their mission was to be much more modest. Most of the Arab world had already been divided into new nation-states by the colonialist powers, even before Versailles had been convened. Only one area remained without clear definition, the Levant. The British and French had already carved it out between themselves in the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. However, President Wilson hoped to calm colonialist hunger by peppering the dish with a bit of liberalism. It was still necessary to know what were the real ambitions of the people living in the areas that Britain and France coveted. And thus, despite demonstrable hostility from Britain and France, the peace conference agreed to delay the establishment of mandate regimes in Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. King and Crane enlisted 7 experts in different fields and set out for the area on June 10, 1919, staying there for 42 days. They visited more than 1,500 locations, an amazing achievement for such a small delegation. They met urban elites, Jewish settlers, and Christian missionaries. They were in Jaffa, Rishon LeZion, Jerusalem, Ramallah, Nablus, Jenin, Nazareth, Haifa, and Acre until they returned to Turkey on board the U.S. Navy destroyer Hazelwood. They were surprised by the sincerity of the urban and rural inhabitants of Palestine. They discovered that most of them were happy to be part of an all-Syrian Arab state, although quite a few of the urban inhabitants hoped that an independent Palestine would eventually be established. They mainly knew what they did not want: a Zionist presence, the Balfour Declaration, and a British or French mandate. King and Crane's final report was undecided, except on one point: the negative impact the Balfour Declaration would have on the people of Palestine. Their report troubled the governments in Paris and London. Ever since 1912, both had toiled over a network of secret agreements that divided up the Greater Syria area, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, between themselves. The Balfour Declaration was thrown into the deal, granting the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine as well as the creation of a Hashemite kingdom in Jordan. The members of the King-Crane Commission discovered that the people who were themselves living in Greater Syria had a different dream, and innocently believed that it would fit with the wider vision of President Wilson. No wonder, then, that the reports were shelved. When President Wilson fell seriously ill and collapsed that summer, the energetic American involvement in the Middle East petered out, and with it disappeared the only American scheme in modern times that attempted to build a new Middle East according to the aspirations of the local population rather than those of Washington and its allies. Sparks of this positive energy would reappear now and again among the more pro-Arab American diplomats and officials of the State Department. This was particularly true in the Mandate period of Palestine. When such experts were asked by President Franklin Roosevelt to provide an assessment of the Zionist movement, they wrote, "It has never been considered, by the U.S. government, that the realization of a Jewish national home was connected with safeguarding American rights and interests. But they mainly recommended pursuing a neutral policy and clandestinely assisting the British." This line held until 1942, when the Zionist leadership in Palestine succeeded for the first time in eliciting overwhelming support from the American Jewish community. This was immediately translated into pressure on the White House to change its position on Palestine and refuse to contemplate ideas such as those proposed by King and Crane. It did not happen in a day. King and Crane's heirs were a professional group of university graduates who manned the State Department sections dealing with the Near East, as they called the area. They were the famous Arabists. Their last significant impact on U.S. policy, which came toward the end of the British Mandate in Palestine, 1948, can tell us something about potential changes to American policy in the near and more distant future. The scene for the last success of the Arabists was the town of Lake Success on Long Island. Contrary to what its name suggests, it is an ancient arena of defeat, that of the Native American Montaukets, who were destroyed in the U.S. genocide. Like so many other locations in the United States, this, too, is named after the chief of the defeated tribe, Sackett. Since the end of colonization, the area has been a military-industrial complex, which armed U.S. forces in both world wars. In 1946, the fledgling United Nations addressed, quite unexpectedly, the mayor of the little town of Lake Success and asked to rent some of the industrial areas, including huge hangars, as a temporary home. In one of them, in November 1947, the UN General Assembly announced the establishment of a Jewish state. But these pleasant Zionist memories disappeared into thin air when, a few months later in the very same hangar, a different spectacle took place. On February 24, 1948, the American delegate to the UN, Warren Austin, declared that his government wished to annul the partition resolution, which included the declaration of the Jewish state, as it wrought havoc and destruction instead of enhancing peace. Austin suggested imposing an international trusteeship over Palestine, pending a better solution. This was a step that ended a long process of rethinking in the State Department in the face of the new reality unfolding in Palestine. The Arabists saw how, under the umbrella of the UN partition resolution, the Zionist movement had begun ethnically cleansing Palestine of its native population. And so, on that day in February, within a week of the first significant Israeli ethnic cleansing operation, focusing on 5 coastal villages and a massacre in the north, Austin gave his speech. President Harry Truman knew very well what was in store for him. He had already developed an antipathy toward the Zionist leaders in his country, such as Aba Hillel Silver, whom his Jewish advisors invited into his chambers every now and then to complain about the State Department. This troubling activity was part of the new pro-Zionist campaign that Jews in the United States had initiated after David Ben-Gurion visited them in 1942. In that year, the Zionist leader convened a meeting in the Biltmore Hotel in New York that was meant to institutionalize the pro-Zionist lobby in the United States. And, indeed, the Zionist retaliation was not long in coming. ABA Hillel Silver arrived, followed by Chaim Weizmann, and, although the president told his advisers that he would not be shouted at anymore, the ploy worked well. It had, after all, been an election year. The United States retracted its policy and Israeli ethnic cleansing raged on point 12. However, the State Department continued to refer to the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine as the root cause of the conflict. Under its guidance, the Palestinian right of return was the backbone of a new UN peace initiative attempted throughout 1949. Then, as they had in February 1948, the White House and other bodies involved in formulating U.S. policy on the question of Palestine at first accepted the department's lead. 1 month was noteworthy, May 1949. In that month, the United States demanded that Israel allow the repatriation of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees, regardless of the cause of their flight and not even pending the conclusion of a final settlement. On May 29, 1949, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, James MacDonald, conveyed a very sharp letter from President Truman to David Ben-Gurion, which made an explicit threat of severe sanctions if Israel did not adjust its policies. This was accompanied by the suspension of a promised loan. In June 1949, Israel succeeded in conveying the impression that it was about to heed the pressure, but asked for time to deal with some technical aspects of the request. In the meantime, conflicts broke out in different parts of the globe as the Cold War began to heat up, hence, until the end of Truman's administration, that pressure was never attempted again. One could argue, though, that, to this day, there has been no official U.S. retraction from the Palestinian right of return. The arabist legacy seemed also to influence Truman's successor, Dwight Eisenhower, but this proved too much for both Israel and the Jewish community. They retaliated with the establishment of AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. This was the Arabists' swan song. Here and there, criticism popped out demanding recognition of the Palestinian people and their claims, especially during George Bush Sr.'s term in the White House. Today, the Arabists hold only very junior positions and play no role in the decision-making process of U.S. Middle East policy. In 2003, the veterans among the Arabists dispatched an impressive petition that accused George Bush Jr. of severely damaging the American national interest by occupying Iraq and uncritically backing Israeli policies. But even Michael Moore has more influence on American policy than they do, despite the long service they underwent in the area, their knowledge of its languages, and their solidarity with the people's basic aspirations there. Since that summer in 1919 when King and Crane tried to translate these qualifications into policy, America's Arab and Palestine policies have become confined to the narrow route efficiently delineated for them by AIPAC, as the years have gone by. The LaGuardia and Kennan legacy. Fiorello H. LaGuardia was born in the Bronx, New York, in 1882. His father emigrated from Italy and his mother was a Hungarian Jew. This double ethnicity became a useful political tool during LaGuardia's career in the American Labor Party, culminating in his becoming a member of the House of Representatives and mayor of New York. At every stage of his political career, until he died in 1947, he drew on his ethnic identity card, Italian or Jewish, to enhance his chances of being elected to coveted positions. He mastered Italian and Yiddish, and some claim his Hebrew was not at all bad. His legacy was such that those who followed him understood how useful were the politics of identity in the overall political scene. LaGuardia unhesitatingly accused opponents of trying to undermine the position of ethnic groups he happened to represent at the time. First the Italians in New York, in East Harlem, then the Jews in Brooklyn, and, even later, the Irish wherever they were. In the 1950s, the next generation of politicians focused on the three I's, Israel, Italy, and Ireland, as the safe bets in local electoral races. From this angle, American foreign policy seems often a reflection of the domestic ethnic balance of power. And within this framework, the pro-Israeli lobby was born. The use that political aspirants in an immigrant society make of their group identity as a career launchpad connects to another phenomenon in American politics, lobbying. The original lobby was the foyer leading to the Congress Hall. In 1830, for the first time, it became packed with people trying physically to influence their representatives, hence the term that is, today, associated with slickly run outfits doing much the same. From 1830 onward, many congressmen and congresswomen have spent time talking with lobbyists. Lobbying produced inevitable corruption, which, in turn, prodded lawmakers to find ways of limiting such crookedness. The first law, passed in 1946, stipulated clear regulations for lobbying, which a few years later would be violated, one, by AIPAC. The most important of them was the absolute prohibition on representing a foreign country. In January 1953, it seemed that, for a moment, Eisenhower wanted to renew American activism over the Palestinian refugee issue. He was heard more than once talking about the need to allow their repatriation. Moreover, unlike his predecessor, Truman, Eisenhower distinguished between the American need to provide humanitarian aid to the refugees in their camps and adherence to principled American support for the right of return. His Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, visited the area and reported that allowing the return of refugees was still physically possible. Even in Congress, the possibilities of resettlement on both sides of the River Jordan were discussed in earnest. President Eisenhower judged that the problem of 300,000 refugees could be solved in such a way. But the Arab world did not endorse the plan and Israel rejected it, both because of its element of return and, more importantly, because it conflicted with the aim of exploiting the Jordan River for the National Carrier Project of supplying water to Israel. The work on the National Carrier Project led to an angry response by the American president, who suspended aid to Israel, pending an end to the diversion of water from the Jordan River that Israel had begun in September 1953. Israel waited for a friendlier administration. This somewhat critical stance was maintained by the United States, and the Suez Crisis in 1956 led, yet again, to a threat of sanctions in response to an aggressive Israeli policy. Thus, in a matter of 7 years, Israel was thrice threatened with American sanctions. The Americans forced the Israelis out of the Sinai, which was a traumatic lesson for the local leadership. The prospects of such an American position expanding and deepening constituted, in the eyes of the Israeli policymakers, a real existential threat. This was definitely the opinion of Israel's ambassador to the UN, Abba Eban. As part of his efforts to sabotage such a development, he enlisted an official, of Canadian origin, who worked in the UN's Public Relations Office, Isaiah L. C. Kennan. Kennan's first assignment was to write an article alerting the public to the dangers incurred by the anti-Israeli orientation of U.S. policy in the Middle East. The same message was forcefully conveyed in a series of articles Kennan published in a new journal, The Near East Policy, which became the pro-Israeli lobby's mouthpiece, funded partly by Israel. Kennan began organizing Jewish support, first in local trade unions and then in communities across the country. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy was founded around the journal as AIPAC's think tank. The first visible result of Kennan's activity was by Jewish members of the Dockers Union, who boycotted Arab ships in U.S. harbors in order to prevent U.S. aid reaching Arab states that did not recognize Israel. Then came, around I-960, the first of many Jewish initiatives on Capitol Hill for anti-Arab legislation. The pro-Israel lobby worked uninterrupted until 1963, when the famous Senator, William Fulbright, became intrigued by its activities and demanded a congressional investigation of its financial sources. The 300 pages produced by the investigating body revealed that, over 4 years, the lobby had raised $5 million, exempted from tax, from the Jewish community in the United States. This was done by the purchase of bonds clandestinely made over to the State of Israel. American law forbade lobbying for the interests of a foreign country. In order to overcome the legal prohibition, it was stated that the bonds were procured only for welfare purposes in Israel. However, the investigating committee found that none of the money was ever delivered to the deprived citizens of Israel. The money went to the Israeli state and, from there, immediately back to the United States directly into AIPAC's account. In Newsweek, August 12, 1963, it was written that the investigation exposed the AIPAC lobby as one of the most effective networks of foreign influence. Fulbright became the pro-Israel lobby's greatest enemy and had to be deposed by all means possible. The campaign against him became an AIPAC model. Everything was done to ensure that he would not be re-elected. Anyone standing against him was financed and supported. From that time to this, the road to the Capitol has been scattered with candidates from the elite of American politics whose careers have been similarly torpedoed by AIPAC. In this manner, AIPAC impacted on Congress policy with such successful results that very few have since dared to follow in Fulbright's footsteps. Kennan was not taken with Eisenhower's successor, John Kennedy, either, but did not dare say so publicly because of the latter's immense popularity. Kennedy disappointed, because he did not introduce any significant change to his predecessor's policy. But Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon Johnson, was a different story altogether. He was attentive to Israel and its needs. When Kennedy was assassinated and Johnson became president, Kennan said, "We lost a good friend, but we found a better one." 5 By 1969, on the 21st anniversary of Israel's founding, the game had come out in the open. Over a huge advertisement published in the New York Times, scores of senators and members of the House of Representatives vowed allegiance to Israel's national agenda: Jewish immigration to Israel from the Soviet Union, unlimited arms from the United States, and tough anti-Palestinian policies by the UN. If Johnson was a true friend, Richard Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, were the pro-Israel lobby's undeniable heroes. When Nixon spelled out his doctrine for safeguarding the American national interest, it included a total reliance on Israel as the main pillar of U.S. policy in the Middle East. AIPAC's mission, on the face of it, had been accomplished. The State Department had been neutralized, and it looked as if only the Jewish electoral voice would be heard when crucial decisions were taken pertaining to Israel's fate or even to the future of the Arab world in general. The reality, however, would be somewhat different. During the administrations of Ford, Reagan, and Bush Sr., AIPAC lost out at crucial junctures in the history of the region. The reason was that the well-oiled mechanism, which included a membership of more than 30,000, had invested so much effort in terrorizing potential anti-Zionist candidates that it allowed some of the actual policy making in Congress to pass unnoticed. Senators, such as Charles Percy of the Republican Party, who were suspected of being unwilling to provide unconditional support to Israel, were deposed. One can, in fact, pick any year since 1963 and find similar victims of AIPAC's campaign. In 1983, AIPAC succeeded in ending the political career of Paul Findley, a member of the House since 1961 and one of the few critics of Israel's policy in the occupied territories. More recently, the African-American members Earl Hilliard and Cynthia McKinney of the Democrats have been targeted. Other sticks were wedged through the wheels of AIPAC's carriage every now and then, when the lobby was overdoing its business. Some of its members were engaged in real espionage work for Israel. Jonathan Pollard was convicted of doing so in 1986 and, in 2004, the FBI investigated others who were charged with spying inside the Pentagon. Larry Franklin, a former senior analyst on the Pentagon's Iran desk, received a prison sentence of nearly 13 years for passing top-secret information to Steve Rosen and Keith Weissman, who worked for AIPAC at the time. 2. These debacles have not, as yet, changed the overall picture. The senior members of the Bush administration, who are involved in formulating policy toward Israel and the Middle East, are all, in one way or another, connected to AIPAC and particularly to its think tank, the Institute for Near East Policy. The most conspicuous among them are Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. They have been present every year at the most glamorous event in the American capital, the AIPAC convention. Each such meeting expresses unconditional support for Israel's policy toward the Palestinians, and anyone opposing this policy is immediately considered by AIPAC to be its enemy. In the United States today, one cannot ignore the level of integration of Jews into the heights of American financial, cultural, and academic power. This has, of course, many positive implications. The Jews in America do not, in Hannah Arendt's words, live outside the society, as they did in Germany. The anti-Semitism that feeds on, among other things, the alienation of the Jewish experience, did not take root in the United States. On the other hand, the exploitation of the fruits of successful integration into American society for the benefit of a foreign country could itself be the pretext for a new surge of anti-Semitism in the future. Ever since Chaim Weizmann wrote angrily in 1949 of the rich Jews who did not do enough for Zionism, Israel's satisfaction at the affluence of American Jewry testifies that much of its capital is intended to maintain American policy in its pro-Israeli tracks. The Five Sisters legacy. There have been those who have argued that, if the principal natural resource of the Middle East had been bananas, the region would not have attracted the interest of various American administrations. But it is oil, not bananas, and this cannot be changed. The Americans began to be interested in the oil fields of the Arab world in the 1920s, and four companies, four of the sisters, Standard Oil of California, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, and Texaco, won the first concessions to look for oil in Saudi Arabia in the first half of the 20th century. In 1938, they discovered it there and in Bahrain. A fifth company, Gulf Oil, found oil a few months later in Kuwait. Since then, the oil wells have become a principal source for financing the American way of life, the electrification and air conditioning of all life systems at unprecedented and unmatched levels of energy waste. Controlling the oil flow, on the one hand, and extracting earnings from its production, on the other, became the double goal of American policy in the Arab world. The emergence of Arab nationalism in the Middle East foiled the second goal. It was Iranians who first nationalized oil production, and even a successful American attempt to topple the Iranian government, with the help of the CIA, did not stop the trend. The next in line was Iraq, which nationalized its oil in 1958. In the Arabian Peninsula, oil royalties gushed more into the local banks than the bank accounts of the Five Sisters. But oil flowed to the United States, even if the dividends were now more evenly divided between Arab regimes and owners of the American oil companies. The pro-oil lobby in America lost its impact when, in 1973, the Arab oil-producing states declared their famous embargo. But when it transpired that this step was not, as declared, meant to assist the Palestinians but rather to bring up oil prices, the embargo became a fleeting episode. After all, such aggressive tactics in the world of business are the bread and butter of the capitalist system. And when prices stabilized, to the satisfaction of all concerned, the oil-producing Arab states began formulating a definite pro-American policy. The lesson was clear. American administrations found they could ensure oil flow from Saudi Arabia and, at the same time, categorically reject any sensible peace proposals made by the Saudi crown for solving the Arab-Israeli conflict. This was the case, for example, in 1981 when King Fahd offered a peace proposal that included recognition of the right of Israel to exist, alongside an independent Palestinian state. Saddam Hussein, too, seemed to be content with warlike anti-Israeli rhetoric while shipping oil to the United States. Only the Iranian Revolution made life difficult for the Americans, but, to confront the new regime in Tehran, the Americans did not need Israel. They preferred to have Saddam Hussein as a bulwark, arming and financing him accordingly. Saddam was also led to believe that all his obsessions, including the return of lost Kuwait to Iraq, would be supported. In October 1989, after the 8-year-long Iran-Iraq War, April Gillespie, the American ambassador in Baghdad, recommended that Bush Sr. issue a presidential decree ordering a significant improvement in the bilateral trade and oil relationship between the two countries. So, the United States purchased $1 billion worth of Iraqi crude oil annually. In 1990, the arabist tradition and oil considerations were juxtaposed with pressure from the pro-Israel lobby. In the Arab world, the Iraqi ruler was perceived as a pan-Arabist hero, due to his army's steadfastness against Iranian plans, and Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz took an active role in regional politics. Again, briefly, discrete interests produced a turn in policy. The downfall of the Soviet Union. The Saudi and Iraqi peace initiatives, and the First Palestinian Intifada, attracted, in a rare and unique historical moment, Washington's attention to the Palestinian point of view. Israel had, at the time, one of its most right-wing governments. Hence, Bush Sr. engaged in a real dialogue with representatives of two Palestinian power bases, the PLO in Tunis and the Palestinian leadership in East Jerusalem, seated in Orient House. The two bases were perceived as moderate, not only by Arabists but also by members of the White House. Was the first time since 1948 that any Palestinian group had been treated in such a way. This was a rare moment of all-Arab consensus on how to solve the conflict, on the basis of the two-state solution, and how to pursue the normalization of the oil supply to the United States. Everyone was happy, apart from Israel and AIPAC. It was, in particular, the pragmatic stance of the Palestinian leadership in Orient House that troubled Israel. Its government reacted with a policy of harassment and the extensive construction of illegal settlements inside East Jerusalem. Official America responded angrily, including a public rebuke from Secretary of State James Baker to the Israeli government. The pro-Israel lobby reacted on two levels. On Capitol Hill, it demonized the Jerusalemite Palestinian leadership and, at the same time, it undermined the alliance with Iraq, aided by its think tank, the Institute for Near East Policy. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait helped enormously on the road to accomplishing the second goal. But it should be noted that the United States had not hesitated to condone such invasions when they served its policy. Around that time, its army invaded Grenada and Panama. AIPAC created an anti-Iraq atmosphere long before Saddam Hussein's army invaded Kuwait, but the U.S. ambassador in Baghdad concealed this from him, even hinting that the United States would not oppose the invasion. When Iraq did invade Kuwait, the option of sanctions was not even brought forward. The president had been led to this uncompromising policy by a number of experts in the National Security Council and the Pentagon who had known links to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. The first goal, of demonizing the moderate Palestinians, proved to be tougher. There are always exceptions to the rules of history, and it so happened that George Bush Sr. was ready to tackle Iraq. He accepted Secretary of State James Baker's preference for an Arab coalition as the best means of protecting American interests in the Middle East, even if the price was a peace conference in Madrid that was categorically rejected by Israel. At the Madrid Peace Conference, Bush Sr. and his Secretary of State were highly impressed by the Palestinian delegation and the leadership evolving around Orient House. Even before Madrid, the beginning of an American dialogue with the PLO in 1988, through the mediation of some American Palestinians, including the late Edward Said and Ibrahim Abu-Lughod, contributed to the continued improvement in the attitude toward the Palestinians, after 12 years of aggressive Republican pro-Israeli policy. In that period, with a continuous license to kill from America, Israel invaded 4 Arab states and left behind 1,500 dead citizens. Who knows where it would have ended, had not Bush Sr. and, later, Bill Clinton tamed Israel. Thus, for the first time in years, State Department officials were in close contact with a Palestinian group, the teams of the Orient House in Jerusalem, inducing them to believe that the world's superpower was even willing to chastise Israel for its occupation and lack of flexibility. A Palestinian willingness to accept a mini-state was to be rewarded with pressure on Israel. But the Madrid Conference and the critical reprimand for Israeli brutality in the occupied territories did not last long. At the end of the day, Bill Clinton proved to be easier prey than AIPAC suspected. A typical Democrat, he was of the opinion that, without the Jewish vote, he could not win presidential elections. The victory of the peace camp in the Israeli elections in 1992 enabled Clinton to pursue an explicit pro-Israeli policy that, ostensibly, did not neglect the Palestinian interest. Indeed, Clinton invested much time and energy in the question of Palestine. But the people he appointed to produce a roadmap for peace were mostly Jewish. The remaining Arabists who had a foothold in these issues were pushed out. Without the Arabists, it was easy to advance. On June 30, 1993, a policy paper that stated that Israel should have a free hand in developing, uprooting and colonizing East Jerusalem. So the illegal settlements of the past became the integral neighborhoods of the present. The door was opened for the settlement of 200,000 Jews in the eastern part of the city, and the commencement of the transfer of its 200,000 Palestinian inhabitants. If there were an opposing lobby to AIPAC during Clinton's years, it came from the Republican camp. It was more of a front that included not only oil businessmen but also the tycoons who invested in the arms industry and infrastructure in the Arab world. This military-industrial nexus had representatives in high positions in the administration, a Secretary of State here and a National Security Advisor there. Some of the captains of the arms industry, of course, benefited from military aid to Israel, but others did not fail to see the prospective financial heaven that the Arab world held for them. It was a formidable and powerful front, and yet it failed totally to redirect American policy. No wonder Mearsheimer and Walt were so deeply frustrated when they saw such a front, with its own impressive think tanks and presence in the Ivy League, retreating helplessly in the face of AIPAC's charge forward. No wonder they attributed, in their London Review of Books piece, such mystical powers and forces to the Jewish lobby. This frustration only grew after the election of George Bush Jr. The Bush family and the influence of the military-industrial complex should have led to a greater say for those who represented oil, cement, and weapons. At first, indeed, it looked as if these were the leading considerations. Bush Jr. showed no inclination to be involved where his predecessor had failed. Even the outbreak of the Second Intifada was described as the fruit of Clinton's failed policies, and did not bother the agenda of the new president. But then came the 9/11 attacks and Bush's divine Christian and Zionist interventions. The graduates of the Institute for Near East Policy, Vice President Cheney, Secretary of State Rumsfeld, his deputy Wolfowitz, and chairman of the Defense Policy Board Advisory Committee Pearl, sidelined the more moderate Colin Powell and pressured for a military attack in Iraq. At the same time, a more reasonable assault on al-Qaeda was contemplated in Afghanistan. As Mearsheimer and Walt clearly and convincingly argue, the invasion of Iraq was presented uninhibitedly as, first and foremost, an action to defend Israel against weapons of mass destruction allegedly developed by Saddam Hussein. Today, this same entourage tries to push for a similar policy toward Iran, a plan that is postponed because of the Iraq quagmire. In 2005, a senior official of the administration testified to one of the Senate committees on American policy toward Middle Eastern oil. He enumerated several facts. First, the United States still does not possess an alternative energy source, and therefore its policy ought to aim at safeguarding the flow of Middle Eastern oil at all costs. Second, an unstable Middle East undermines such a flow. Third, global and, in particular, regional trends are anti-American. Thus the U.S. economy faces a real danger due to its dependence on Arab oil. There, again, through the prism of black gold, Israel appears as a liability and not an asset, a message that Arabist policymakers have been trying to convey since 1948. Time will tell if the Five Sisters legacy is eventually successful in balancing the Zionist and Christian lobbies in the United States. The Morgenthau and Waltz legacy. In 1943, the German refugee Hans Morgenthau became naturalized as a U.S. citizen. He had arrived in 1937, taught at the University of Kansas, and then moved to the University of Chicago. No other refugee, apart from the Austrian Henry Kissinger, affected American foreign policy as he did. His book Politics Among Nations, published in 1947, provided the clue to his future influence. Morgenthau likened foreign policy to policy in the business world, that is, decision-making free of sentiments or values and entirely based on cost/benefit considerations and balances of power. The young state of Israel was one of the first to take up his approach. Throughout October 1948, at the height of Israel's ethnic cleansing of Palestine, Morgenthau advised David Ben-Gurion on a host of political issues. The first Prime Minister of Israel decided to reward the academic guru by naming a destroyed and evicted Palestinian village after him. The village of Kirbet Beit Far became Tal Shahar, a translation of Morgenthau to Hebrew. 20 years later, Kenneth Waltz followed suit. He spent most of his teaching years at Berkeley, California. He is still today the doyen of international relations as an academic discipline. His claim to fame was a book, Theory of International Politics, published in 1979, which challenged some of the basic assumptions of Morgenthau's realist approach. Hence, while Morgenthau is referred to as the father of realism in international relations, Waltz is the father of neorealism. Waltz argued that, in the field of international relations, there are no clear patterns of conduct because of the absence of a point of gravity and authority, although he later asserted that U.S. policy could, nevertheless, be based on the cost/benefit considerations that had been sketched by Morgenthau. His is still the ideological infrastructure of most studies in international relations research centers in America. From these centers graduated the American diplomats who were selected to conduct the peace process in the Middle East. The first administration to appoint such a team was that of Richard Nixon, though it was not until the first Bush administration that the existence of such a group became public knowledge. Various experts, some from the State Department and others from the National Security Council and academia, translated the realist and neorealist theories into actual policies. The end result can be summarized as policy based on three principal guidelines. The first and most important is that a peace process has to be based on the local balance of power in the conflictual area. Thus, when a search begins for the components of a prospective solution, these have to be adapted more to the perception of the stronger party and less to that of the weaker party. We can clearly see, from the very beginnings of the attempt to construct a Pax Americana in Palestine, more or less since 1969, that what the Americans marketed as a peace plan was a formula meant to satisfy the Israeli point of view. The result was a constant and curious disregard of the Palestinian point of view and, more importantly, of what American experts had themselves earlier defined as the heart of the problem, the refugee issue. Today, because the process is in essence an American show, the refugee issue is still written out of the peace script. It is hard to think of a similar concentrated diplomatic effort in modern times that has evaded the root problem of a given conflict. The inevitable collapse of peace efforts at subsequent stages has not altered the basic American position. The second guideline, stemming directly from the first, is that only the stronger party in the conflict should be consulted when the features of a prospective solution are looked for. But within that stronger party, the mediators should seek the peace camp. Its perception is the most flexible element within that stronger party. And its perception has to be imposed on the weaker party. The essence of peacemaking thus became, first, to detect a peace camp in Israel in every given historical moment and, then, to attempt to force the view of that camp on the Palestinians. Until 1977, the Israeli Labor Party was that camp. Then, until 1984, the moderate wing of the Likud won the title while it was in power. In the days of Israeli unity governments, which lasted, with a few breaks, until 1992, it was not so much a party as a collection of political figures that, in the eyes of the American experts, represented the political center in Israel. In this century, Ariel Sharon has embodied this camp for the Americans, as today does the party he established, Kadima. The latter is a dream party for any American mediator who wishes to implement the second guideline in peacemaking and the management of conflicts. Management, according to the neo-realists, means maintaining the conflict as a low-intensity confrontation, which means the loss of local, human lives, without any damage to the mediating superpower. The debate inside Israel over the future of the areas it occupied in 1967 helped, of course, to consolidate this guideline. It created the false impression of a genuine debate between a peace camp, willing to withdraw fully from the occupied areas, and a war camp, favoring a greater Israel. Since the realist approach did not allow engagements with marginal groups, it focused on the Israeli Labor Party. So, when the latter selected the Jordanians as the only partners for negotiations over the future of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the American peace plan was exclusively based on the Jordanian option. Henry Kissinger was sent to convince the Jordanians to accept the Israeli peace plans, but these offered too little space for the Hashemite leader to be induced to take part in the process. Yet these plans, which offered to leave a sizable part of the West Bank in Israel and enclave the Gaza Strip as an open-air prison, have remained the basis of any peace plan conceived by successive Israeli peace camps or American roadmaps to peace. As long as the PLO was too weak to prevent a Jordanian monopoly over the peace plan, American diplomats followed Kissinger and tried to build an Israeli-Hashemite alliance, at the expense of the Palestinians. But, in 1976, the people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip deposed the pro-Hashemite leadership in democratic elections, and replaced it with one that identified with the PLO. The Americans still refused to include the PLO as a legitimate partner in peace and accepted Israel's image of the organization as a terrorist outfit in the service of the USSR, rather than a liberation movement. Thus, the realist approach connected with the perceptions of the American Christian right, Israel's image as the frontline fighter in the Holy War against the Soviet Antichrist continued to dominate American policy in the area. Later, the Antichrist was substituted and became the Muslim, but Israel retained its special position defending the realm at the very front of the battlefield. This approach distanced the Americans even further from the Palestinian point of view and from the historical UN attempt to solve the conflict. The Palestinians insisted that the conflict with Israel did not break out in 1967, but stemmed from the ethnic cleansing that Israel committed in 1948. They also tried, with little success, to convey to the Americans a different narrative of the PLO's origins and essence, an organization built by the refugees in order to facilitate their return. There seemed also little point in highlighting for American policymakers the transformation of Fatah's position in 1974. This was when the movement consented to the creation of a Palestinian mini-state on the territories Israel occupied in 1967, 22% of historical Palestine, provided the right of return would be retained and peace would reign. The basic misunderstanding of Palestinian conditions surrounding the two-state solution led to the fatal course taken later within the framework of the Oslo Accord and the shaky peace proposals that followed in the wake of its demise. The third guideline is that the peace process has no history. Every attempt begins afresh from a starting point that assumes that there have never been such attempts in the past. Such an approach disables a process of learning, crucial for anyone facing complex human problems of ethnic and national conflicts. This approach fit well with the interests of those who led the Zionist peace camp in Israel. Thus, when the United States returned to the politics of Palestine in 1969, the Zionist peace camp's understanding that 1967 was the day the conflict broke out became rooted in the American conscience and, due to the second guideline, their position became seen as the outline for the whole peace process. Therefore, the peace process became an effort to find a solution to the question of the areas Israel occupied in 1967. The year 1948 was excluded from the peace agenda and, with it, the Palestinians were pushed out as claimants, to be replaced by the Hashemites of Jordan. Only in 1988, when the Hashemite dynasty seemed to have had enough of waiting for a deal, and had probably also noticed the strengthening of a collective Palestinian identity in the occupied territories, which unequivocally supported the PLO, was a new realist approach called for. Thus in 1988, when King Hussein declared the cession of the West Bank from Jordan, a new Israeli, and, in turn, new American approach developed. The collapse of the Soviet Union weakened, in any case, the image of the PLO as a Soviet agent and eased the onset of PLO-American negotiations. These started in Tunis that year. The Israeli peace movement declared that it was now willing to enter negotiations with the PLO. Again, there was a fusion of discrete historical processes, which matured during the Clinton administration. Never before had international relations academics been given such a free hand in engineering a peace process as Dennis Ross and his friends during the Clinton days. The disastrous fruits of the theoretical games they played with our lives, here in Palestine and Israel, are still with us. The three guidelines were put to the test. The peace camp was now the Rabin Labor government. The bargain was the same: Israel was willing to withdraw from only part of the occupied territories. The sole change was a new weak recipient, the PLO. It was asked to accept, not only part of the territories, but also only part of the authority in them. In addition, it was asked to give up the refugees' right of return or a claim to Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the reality in the occupied territories changed as well. The settlement project expanded to such proportions that it simply accentuated the humiliating nature of the new Israeli proposal for peace. It is true that, in the very same period, the 1980s and 1990s, American peacemakers could have listed a number of achievements in the realm of Israeli bilateral relations with Jordan and Egypt. Ironically, these peace treaties were concluded because of minimal American involvement in the negotiations. The formula for their success, if the cold peace between Israel and its two neighbors can be described as such, was that the treaties did not relate to the Palestine question. The Oslo Accord, although it began in a similar way, namely with minimal American involvement, did become an American show. In fact, for the troubled President Clinton, it was the only show in town. And, at first, it looked likely to work, since the Israelis and the Americans found a Palestinian leader who was willing to succumb to pressure, so completing the process, a plan for peace conceived in the Israeli peace camp, dictated to and accepted by the Palestinians. As we know now, it was possible because the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat believed that this state of affairs was temporary. He believed that the Israeli peace camp would dominate the scene for 5 years before the commencement of final status negotiations, which would bring into consideration the basic Palestinian position. When did Arafat realize he was cheated? We do not know. Was it in Cairo in 1994 when he had to be almost physically coerced by President Hosni Mubarak to sign the Oslo Agreement, and when the vague ideas of the September 1993 Declaration of Principles were being translated by Israeli generals into an impossible reality? The expansion of Israeli settlements, the enclaving of Palestinian autonomous areas within the settlements, military bases, and highways were not combined with any solution for Jerusalem or the refugee problem. Or did he feel it during the grotesque show Clinton staged much later, in 2000, when he was again physically pushed into a hut in Camp David to sign the Palestinian letter of submission to neo-realist logic? The submission text included a final solution that consisted of a Palestinian Bantustan in part of the occupied territories, and peace for Israel. Even for the fragile Arafat, this was too much. He resisted, and the rest, as we know, is indeed history. A sterile version of this outline was repeated after the Second Intifada broke out. American mediators attempted in vain to revive their mechanism in the framework of the roadmap that led to nowhere. The Zionist colonization deepened and produced a particularly desperate resistance, which, in turn, produced the barbaric retaliation so familiar to us today. And thus, instead of Dennis Ross and his team asking themselves, as a possible explanation for the lack of progress, who in Israel benefits economically from the occupation, came 9/11. The ensuing narrative was easily plotted. Primitive Islamic fanaticism explained the inability of the Palestinians to take part in a reasonable and sensible Pax Americana. Ariel Sharon and, after him, Ehud Olmert composed another Israeli version of peace, disengagement from Gaza, while leaving the Palestinians even less territory than was promised to them in Oslo in 1993 and Camp David in 2000. The new prescription was a lasting peace based on a Palestinian state stretching over 12% of historical Palestine, with no real sovereignty or economic independence and, of course, with no solution to the fate of Jerusalem or the refugee problem. Again, the developing reality on the ground was grimmer than the words on the pages. Gaza became a huge prison camp, bombarded and starved, with American official and civil society alike blindly standing by. But, who knows, they may still find a Palestinian who will call it an acceptable solution. Conclusion. Of all these historical clusters, it is the bottom line that is definitive, displayed in great strength at the AIPAC Annual Convention of 2005. In the Washington Congress Center, 26,000 kosher meals were prepared, decorated with 32,640 hors d'oeuvres, 5 tons of salmon, 2.5 tons of turkey, 1 ton of poultry, and 1 ton of hummus. It was enough to feed the 5,000 participants. This culinary feast is only matched by one other event in Washington, the annual joint meeting of the two houses of Congress. The list of guests is similar at both events. Another bottom line can be shown not in tons but in dollars. Since 1949, the United States has passed to Israel more than $100 billion in grants and $10 billion in special loans. Other bodies not part of the administration annually transfer to Israel $1 billion. This is larger than the amount of money transferred by the United States to North Africa, South America, and the Caribbean put together. Their joint population amounts to over 1 billion people. Israel's population is 7 million. Over the last 20 years, $5.5 billion has been given to Israel for military purchases. The RE is no precedent for such bilateral relations, and one does not have to overstate the implications of such a policy for the Palestinians and for the chances of peace in the Middle East. But in this historical narrative, there are also rays of hope. In the complex reality that formulates the American policy, there are factors and processes that, in the past, directed it on a more positive track. And it may be that history, as Michel Foucault tried to convince us, is a list of discrete, disconnected processes whose joint impact is not linked to any one of them but to their fusion into one big explosion. In that case, history is not just a linear movement of endless American support for Israel against, and at the expense of, the Palestinian cause, but a more distorted, curved line of ups and downs that indicate possible changes in the future. Moreover, a concerted effort to bring about such a change is a worthy goal, inside and outside the United States. But what we have this year is the ominous call at the 2006 AIPAC Convention for the United States to attack and invade Iran.